Hello, Akilesh.
Hi.
Thank you for accepting my invitation. I will do a little presentation of your background. You're a spiritual mentor and author with over 2 decades of dedication to Advaita Vedanta,
Mhm.
and you provide contemporary interpretation of Ramana Maharshi's teaching as a pathway to the ultimate truth and freedom. And you have authored two books on the journey to self-realization. The first is How to Find What Isn't Lost, and the second one is Spiritual Dialogues with Akilesh, Q&A on liberation and truth. And for my first question, could you share with us the story of your spiritual journey and who were your teachers and influences?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting question because really it could start the journey at different points. But um, I mean, I think the reality is I was probably very interested in God and spirituality, questions of existential meaning, um, and feeling a connection to those things, probably from a very early age. Maybe almost as long as I can remember, really, in some sense. But yeah, even the 8 or 9, I definitely had, clear some clear interest in that area. But I kind of really mark the start of my spiritual journey per se at about 15 when I felt, you know, depressed, and
Mm.
I think it was depressed for many reasons that were probably connected to my upbringing and my family, but there was also definitely an element of what I might call existential depression and
Mm.
questions about, well, why am I here? Why are we here? What is the point of it all? Um, and and this is a saying in many such interviews I always bring this up, but it really is true, which is, there's an old saying that when the student is ready, the teacher will come. And so at that time in my life, a mentor named Swami Bodhananda Saraswati, who is a traditional teacher of Advaita Vedanta, came from India to the United States for the first time, and my mother hosted him for a couple of weeks. And actually, at this particular point in my life, though I had been very sort of interested in God and spirituality from a young age, I had a certain sort of atheist period for a few years. And when I met him, I was in that period of time, and uh, unlike many other people I had spoken to, he was willing to engage me in conversation. He didn't deflect questions, and he had, a vast knowledge. So he could really respond, and we could go back and forth. And when he was there at my mother's house for a few weeks, I was just constantly engaging him in conversation, questions, and I started to become very interested in this stuff. And every year he would visit for a few weeks, and I would just basically monopolize his time. And he patiently dealt with all my questions. And to the end of a few years period of just a few weeks at a time, really, I had gotten probably many of the fundamentals of Advaita Vedanta in its core. I thought I had sort of understood it, but the reality was I was just on the beginning of my
Mm.
journey. So, then again, it's interesting, how we build these narratives. I'm sure in my narrative, I'm going to be omitting many things that were actually important, but they're just not part of the story as I now conceive it. But the reality is they were there. But anyway, I'll just say, right, I thought I sort of understood. I had a whole plan for how to get to the truth. And then when I was in college, I found that I ran into a brick wall. I had ideas about meditating,
Mm.
sleeping right, eating right, exercising right, this, that, and the other thing, all kinds of plans. And I found I couldn't motivate myself to do those things. And then the next really several years were spent figuring out, well, why not? These are good for me. Why am I not motivated to do them? And the answer, it turned out over the next, I don't know, 13, 14, 15 years, was my psychology,
Mm.
and I had not understood myself. There are very many key pieces of my own psychology that I was hiding from myself, not deliberately, but just because, the unconscious is at work and protects ourselves from other parts of ourselves that we don't want to see because of shame, because of societal disapproval. And so, the next decade or more was spent dealing with that. How? Through various a lot of self-searching mechanisms, a lot of just flailing around, different romantic relationships, a bunch of therapy. I didn't know where I was going, but I was just struggling with these things in various ways. A lot of emotional baggage, basically, in a nutshell. But in college, even though I had sort of come to a sort of certain kind of impasse in my searching, nevertheless, I did encounter Ramana Maharshi the first time. And, because I already had some knowledge of Vedanta, I immediately knew he was very important. I was like, okay, I felt a bell ring. But I also knew that I didn't fully understand him. And so from that point, again, about 10, 11 years later, after a bunch of all this messy emotional stuff, I happened to revisit him. Now, all through this time, this emotional time, it's not like I ever fully left the spiritual. It was always there in one form or another. I was reading, I was trying stuff, I was thinking about it, I was talking to Swami Bodhananda, who was always there as an informal mentor. I never formally became a student. It was always an informal relationship. And his path is a little bit different from Ramana Maharishi's. It's, at core, they are the same, but there's some differences in flavor. But anyway, I never fully left it. After I'd done a bunch of this sort of emotional searching and finding and flailing and whatnot, when I revisited Maharishi at that time, because someone asked me to teach a little study group on Hinduism, and I chose Maharishi's texts, suddenly it became far clearer what he was talking about. Like, it was much, much clearer. And at that point, I really felt a very strong call to practice, as best I could, what he was talking about. And I spent about a year, I guess it really was about a year, very, very strong searching at that point. Now, the reality is, I think I'd been searching the whole time, right? So it's not like that was just 1 year. It was really 20 years. But anyhow, at the end of that point in time of doing a lot of self-inquiry and surrender, I felt I had, quote unquote, a moment of profound clarity that resolved the search in some sense. And then from that point onwards, more or less, because I'd been reading a lot, all these 2 decades before that and whatnot, I felt the desire to become a teacher. So that was pretty much what happened.
And so can you now explain what is Advaita Vedanta and the concept of non-duality? How would you explain it to someone unfamiliar with these
Yes,
notions?
sure. Yes, very good question. So, okay. So Advaita just means not two, non-dual. And Vedanta means the end of the Vedas. So the Vedas are the sacred Hindu scriptures, the oldest sacred Hindu scriptures. At the end of them, that are what are called the Upanishads. So the Vedas as a whole are highly ritualistic texts that deal with how to appease the gods, to ensure health and prosperity and your lineage and all of that sort of thing. The Upanishads, which are the end of the Vedas or Vedanta, are kind of in a way almost the opposite, because they're like, we're no longer dealing with material goods. We're dealing with something which is beyond material reality. It's the supreme spiritual truth that's beyond change. So Advaita Vedanta means the non-duality doctrine that comes from the Upanishads, basically, the end of the Vedas. Now, what does non-dual mean? What does non-duality mean? So basically, the way I like to explain it, different ways of explaining it, the way I like to explain it is essentially that the sense that you are an individual person, basically. I mean, any way I put it is going to be a problem, but the sense that you are this individual person that's locked in this particular body, this particular mind with its limitations, right? I'm only here, I'm not there. I'm only now, I'm not then, I'm not in the future, right? I only have this set of capabilities. I don't have those set of capabilities. I have all kinds of boundaries around what I can do and what I can't do. I want things that I can't get. I'm subject to chance. My loved ones are subject to chance. My hopes and dreams, I can't control whether they're fulfilled or not. Right? All of those limitations, right, are part of your sort of sense that you are this particular person. So that sense of identity with an individual is a profound kind of illusion. That sense of identity with the individual is what makes us feel like we are subject to loss, death, pain, basically everything unpleasant, right? That we don't want, unhappiness, you name it. So what Advaita Vedanta says is that sense of being a person is a kind of illusion, and through certain process, it can be seen through. When that illusion is seen through, something else turns out to actually be what we really are. This something else it's not a thing. It's something radically different from a thing. It's, we can try to describe it in words, but really it's outside of any verbal description. But still, if we try to describe it in words, we would say it would be something like this perfect, complete essence, which is pure intelligence, pure awareness, pure being, which lacks nothing, which is beyond time, beyond space, beyond birth, beyond death, beyond all the problems, everything that's in life, all the issues in life. But it's not nothing. It's not nothing. But it's also something indescribable, and which is incredibly beautiful, and it cannot be limited. It's beyond even the idea of God, because God is like a supreme being, but this is beyond any idea whatsoever. And yet, Advaita Vedanta says, this thing, this non-thing thing that we're calling the self, or in Hindu terminology, Brahman, that's a Sanskrit word for it, we are somehow in touch with it continuously. So this is not some hidden, far away, mysterious thing over there. This is something we are actually experiencing every moment. Because literally, why? Because it is ultimately the light that illuminates our mind. We've confused ourselves with the picture that we are looking at.
But
and that's basically
the question of the practice comes in, because it seems that it's already there, and we can hear that sometimes in certain teachings that the practice could become counterproductive by reinforcing the notion of a separate self. So what's your take on this one?
Yeah. So it's very interesting. So the nature of the illusion at work, okay, when we talk about the illusion of being a person, this is not a normal illusion, because a normal illusion is one thing being mistaken for another thing. In this illusion, we have something which is not a thing at all. That's the self, which is not a thing, seeming to be mistaken for a thing. And so it doesn't work like a normal illusion. In truth, actually, the self, which is actually all there is, there's nothing but the self, can't really be fooled. there is only the illusion of an illusion, actually. And there's an illusion of an illusion of an illusion of an illusion and all that, all the way up. So there is something going on here that we can't express in words. Okay? So this has to be kept in mind, that actually, truly, in truth, the self, which is what you actually are, is currently not fooled into thinking it is a person. There's actually no real illusion. At the same time, the seeker is playing a game. The game is, but I feel like I'm a person. I may know in the abstract that I'm really this essence that cannot be fooled, that is pure light. But at the same time, it feels like I'm a person. It feels like I'm a person. It feels like I'm subject to limitations. So there's two sides of the coin that have to be kept in mind simultaneously. One side is, I'm already that. The other side is, but I don't feel like it. And the I don't feel like it side has to be honored as well. There's a game that has to be played. The game is the mind, which is really the instrument of both ignorance and the instrument ultimately that grants spiritual knowledge. This mind is the battleground for the spiritual search. What basically prevents spiritual knowledge is the series of attachments to things in the world and things in the mind that create a sense of identity. These things are basically our entire constellation of memory, desire, fear, other emotions. Okay, that whole complex constellation of thought and emotion creates a kind of webbed network that reinforces the identity and the illusion of being an individual. Now, it's true. This network cannot ever, even for 1 second, truly fool the self. The self is not fooled. At the same time, again, the seeker feels like a person. So the seeker must play the game of mental purification. That's what the practices basically are. The problem is in the mind. The solution is also, in some sense, in the mind. Now, what's interesting is, as one pursues the practices, various kinds of practices, and the mind is purified, when the truth is so-called revealed, the content of that truth will be, ultimately, that there was no problem in the first place, and there was no solution either, and there was no search, and there was no finding. That's the content of the truth. So can practice become counterproductive? The answer is, ultimately, what happens is, yes, in the very, very final thing, practice will be itself a problem. But Ramana Maharshi makes this analogy. He says, the practice is like, he's a famous analogy. So Ramana Maharshi, for those of your viewers who don't know, is a very famous Indian sage who lived in South India and was a kind of spiritual master. And he brilliantly simplified the Advaita Vedanta tradition, which is very complicated, into very, very, very distilled and clarified terms. Okay, and he was just a genius. So that's why I reinterpret those ideas. But basically, Maharishi said, there's a stick that we use to light the cremation fire. Because in India, bodies are cremated. We use that to light the fire, and then at the end, that stick will burn itself up. Mm-hmm. So in the same way, that's how the practice works. What happens is, our mind currently, for most people, is concerned with 10,000 different things, 10,000 different hopes and fears and whatever it is, all our issues. The practice consolidates from the mind from 10,000 things to one thing. not the self. That's not the self. That's a thought. We're still in the realm of things. From 10,000 to 1, then that pure concentrated mind will then burn itself up and allow something which is not a thing to shine. You cannot go from the 10,000 things to 0. That's not an option you have as a seeker, because as a seeker, you feel like you're a person, and a person can only do things. Even doing nothing, so to say, is a doing of sorts. So you must do something. And so something is advised. That something is a certain kind of concentration. Within concentration, there are different options. Maharishi recommends certain options as superior to other options for certain reasons that we can talk about later. But the point is, the mind must be concentrated. The basic battleground is the dispersed mind must be concentrated. Then that concentrated mind must look inward. I mean, this is all part of the same process. The concentrated mind looking inward will pierce through the illusion. And when the illusion is pierced, the truth will shine by itself. And what is that truth? The truth is always shining. It never didn't shine. There was no illusion and all that. So, there is something very peculiar about the situation, no question, right? Like, it will take a long time to digest this fact. And the truth is, it will never be fully digested because the illusion is magic. There's something very magical about this. Like, how can it be that, I find something, but when I find it, it will tell me that I never found anything. I mean, it doesn't make any sense, right? There's something which blows the mind here, right? Where the mind simply cannot grasp it. But my point anyway here is, I'm very much an advocate of, yes, practice is required. Practice is not counterproductive. At the point when practice becomes a problem, practice will eat itself up automatically. So it's not for the seeker to say practice is no longer required. Practice will be taken from the seeker at the appropriate moment by, you can say, divine grace. All the seeker can do is increasingly seek in like a with a laser beam concentration, right? As they seek, attachments weaken, the mind becomes more concentrated, the desire for the spiritual liberation will increase. Again, a desire for spiritual liberation. That sounds like something which is an attribute of a limited self. Well, that's true. It is. That's fine. You need that. You need that as an intermediate step. You need the practice. You need a desire for spiritual liberation. Those will destroy themselves automatically at the appropriate time. But all the seeker can do is focus their energies from the outward things to that single one thing. And then God or the universe or the self will do the rest.
That's perfectly clear. And it's really pragmatic, and it's reassuring to it's comforting to hear a teacher say, maybe I got to a point where I don't have to practice anymore, but the seeker has to practice to come to this point, and it's different from the neo-Advaita,
That's right.
where they seem to forget
Yes.
one basic element, which is there is some kind of cause and effect. And,
Yes.
and
Yes. Absolutely.
very comforting. And you talked about the practices. Okay, could you elaborate on what kind of practices? I think that there's a self-inquiry and surrender.
Surrender.
Yes, could you talk about these two?
Yes, sure. So I'll put it in a larger context. What I always tell people, I mean, there's different ways of looking at things. So these two practices, which I'll describe in a minute, are what I would call like the spear tip practices, right? They are the spiritual edge of the weapon, right? But the reality is, technically speaking, there's the whole rest of the mind and the body to consider as well. So there's different frameworks for thinking about this. One simple framework is, I tell people, look, if you're a seeker, you need some kind of basic intellectual framework to understand the search. Now, some people need more than a basic intellectual framework. Some people need a very complicated intellectual framework. I was one of those people, because the more doubts you have, the more intellectual answers you need. If you're fortunate and blessed, you have faith quickly, you don't need as many answers, and you can just proceed. But unfortunately, I was not one of those people. So you need some intellectual framework. You need, in one way or another, to deal with your emotional issues. Mm-hmm. Now, I had to do that in many difficult ways. I strongly suggest to many people psychoanalysis as a particularly useful therapy, but there are other ways of dealing with things. But essentially, you need to quiet the mind by, one way or the other, becoming more authentic emotionally. You know, what does that mean? It basically means that you understand what it is that you are really feeling, and decrease the amount that you are deceiving yourself about what you really want, even if what you want is shameful to society or unaccepted by your family, right, et cetera, right? You know, more authenticity you have emotionally, and the more you're able to authentically follow your true desires, even if they are not always spiritual desires, by the way, you know, you will quiet and integrate the mind at a psychological level. So if an intellectual level, if the psychological level, and then, you know, I should add in, by the way, there's also a bodily level, right? That can also be important. There could be a social level. We can add in different things, because basically what's the idea? The point is, the mind has to be, the more quiet it is, the easier to do the practice. The more agitation, the harder. Now, the spiritual practices which I'm about to describe are themselves also have great power to quiet the mind. But, you know, if they are introduced into an already relatively quiet mind, it will be easier to do those practices. And the way I view it is, the practices of surrender and self-inquiry are like a diamond-tipped scalpel. You know, like they are very, very sharp. They can cut through anything, but they may not be the best tool for demolishing a building. You know, you may want to first demolish the building, and then the very small final elements use a scalpel for. You know, so, you know, I give the example sometimes to people of, you know, if you're extremely hungry, for example, right? Can you use the spiritual practices to deal with your hunger? Yes, you can, technically, but it may be easier just to eat something. So, you know, so you have to acknowledge, right, when we talk about quelling attachments, we don't mean denying every need. What we mean is, getting things to a relatively quieter level. You were never going to destroy all the attachments. You were just trying to quiet the mind relatively quiet, relatively weaken, because you cannot destroy all the attachments directly. That can only be done through divine grace and the power of spiritual knowledge, in which case the attachments will be seen to be something quite different than what they seem. So, you know, that's why if you look, for example, the scriptures too, scriptures not just in Hinduism, but in all the religions, all the mystical traditions, right? Why do they have, for example, injunctions about morality, right? Oh, you should be kind, you should be compassionate, you should be honest, you should be this, you should be that. Why? Because when you live that way, you invite less conflict into your life. Less conflict means less mental agitation. Less mental agitation means more energy to do the practice. More concentration ability, basically. We want the mind's ability to concentrate to be at the maximum level, okay? So there's other things, right? Eating a certain way will help your body feel better about itself. That will give you more energy. Sleeping a certain way will do the same, right? There's a lot of elements, right? If you look at, you know, the very traditional Advaita scriptures, there are supposed to be supposedly certain qualifications for learning about ultimate spiritual knowledge, qualifications of a seeker, and the seeker should have so much mental control and physical control, et cetera, you know, lots of things, lots of qualifications of psychological and bodily balance already before approaching the final knowledge. That's technically the case. Now, Ramana Maharshi said, probably there has been nobody who's ever had all those qualifications. You know, just to be clear, right, there's a big pyramid of stuff, right? And I tell people as well, you know, there is a ladder of spiritual and religious practices, which meet people wherever they are, right? Not everybody is necessarily will resonate with final spiritual practices. Like, it will not mean anything to many people, but for some people, just going to a temple or church once a week, that's all they can do. But it's something. It will start to increase some connection to the spiritual. Anyway, so this is just, the point is, there's many pieces, many ways of quieting the mind, and sometimes you have to see, where is my mind and body unbalanced? Like, it may not always be the case that the final spiritual practices are the best way of dealing with that particular mental disquietude. You might have to step into a different context, a different domain, and deal with it in that domain. And that's what happened with me, right? I was approaching things spiritually. I hit a wall, and then I was forced to go into the emotional path for a while. I had to deal with that. Otherwise, I could not progress spiritually. And, I didn't know that's what I was doing, but that's what I was doing. So just to make that clear. So that's all part of the spiritual path, really. Now, that said, what are the final spiritual practices? Maharishi says there are two. I think it's basically a very good summary, really, of the ultimate spiritual practices of Advaita Vedanta generally. So what are these two practices? The first is called self-inquiry. The second is called surrender. So I'm going to describe them very briefly, basically. But I also tell people, these practices, when practiced, are themselves the teachers of the practice. Because as you do them, you will learn what they are. However one describes them, and however much one reads Maharishi or listens to my videos, you will never fully understand except by going in. It's like trying to learn to swim, like, one can read as many books as you like, you have to swim, and something will click. And finally, right, the real final result will be, as you do the practice, you'll realize, oh, I thought that was self-inquiry. Now I realize, no, it's actually this. And then it's like, peeling a shell within a shell within a shell. And then finally, the real truth in the end will be, oh, actually, what I thought was the practice is just the nature of being. That actually the true self is always continuously in this practice, is this practice. Actually, the practice is going on. Actually, that's the truth. Also, I'll say, so many things I could say about this, but the way one is advised to try to do these practices is not just for 10 minutes here or 15 minutes there, or even an hour or two or three, but at all times, at all waking moments. This is the aspiration. Now, I know it's going to be impossible. I'm not suggesting that one can immediately do this, or maybe one can ever do this, but this is the attempt. The attempt is at all times, when you're walking, talking, cooking, working, whatever it is you're doing, trying to do these practices. Okay, so anyway, self-inquiry. So self-inquiry, the basic idea is, there is a very elementary moment-to-moment sense of your own existence. Like right now, you feel, that you're here. You're here. You are alive. You are aware. These are all synonyms. And so inquiry says, where is that knowledge coming from? Can I turn my attention towards me? Now, what happens when people try to do this is, there's many things, different things that can happen, but for example, right, one common sense that people might have is, oh yeah, I feel like I'm here. I'm in my head. Let's just say, I feel like I'm coming from here somehow. Okay. So the basic rule of self-inquiry is, what I am aware of can't be me. Because if it were me, I would not be able to be aware of it as a separate thing. Like, I would be unified with it. So I couldn't see it. I couldn't notice it, So when I notice anything, anytime I notice anything, really, there's a few different things going on. I notice a thing. I notice that I am not the thing. And I notice that I am. So there's like those three facets of the experience, so normally we are focused on the thing. When I say the thing, I mean anything that we are experiencing, and that could include anything in the outside world or could include anything in the inside world. So anything that I'm seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, feeling, anything that I'm thinking, anything that I'm remembering, anything that I'm imagining, anything that I'm emotionally feeling, all my emotions, anger, fear, hope, dread, awe, happiness, unhappiness, pain, pleasure, right? You name it. These are all things I'm experiencing, right? Any spiritual concept, all the spiritual concepts, all concepts, period, all things I'm experiencing, right? So the point is to note that amongst all these experiences, alongside every experience or part of every experience, there is accompanying it or part of it, the knowledge that I am here experiencing this. So that I part, the sense of I am not this experience, but I'm here experiencing it. Like, where is that part coming from? Because if I look at, I don't know, a box in front of me, I experience the box, but the box is not telling me that I am. I look at the box and I simultaneously know the box is here, it's in my field of vision, and I'm also here viewing the box. So that second piece, the I part, where I'm here as the experiencer of the box, is the underrated, underappreciated, usually backgrounded part of the experience. So what self-inquiry says is that background part, like, what is it exactly? What exactly is that part? Like, can you find it? And what happens is when you do self-inquiry, you try to look for that information. Where is that information? How do I know I'm here? Like, I know I can see the box. I can draw, if I'm hearing a sound, I know what that sound kind of means. And if I have a thought, like, I kind of know what that is. But the sense of experiencing, like, what is that? What is that? And as you look for yourself, your sense of existing, what turns out to happen is you start hopping from object to object to object, looking for me. Like where am I? And then I see one thing, I see another thing. All kinds of things can erupt in this process, right? Like you might say, I feel like I don't know where I am. Okay, for example, a very common response eventually, I don't know. So I don't know. I don't know is a thought. It's a thought that's occurred to you. So I don't know. The example I always give with this is it's sort of like you're looking for a flashlight in a room, okay? And then in a dark room. And then you've turned on the flashlight and you're using the flashlight on a big banner that reads, I don't know where the flashlight is. Right? So that very knowledge by which you know that you are experiencing the thought, I don't know, is right there, accompanying that thought. So, so self-inquiry is to try to recognize that this information is right here. Now, simultaneously, it's a riddle, of course, obviously. So, it is, it's shocking how, even as it is right here, as soon as you start looking for it, it becomes so elusive. Like, how come it's right here? I'm experiencing this information every second of every day. But when I go looking for it, suddenly I can't seem to find it. Like it's like it's very, very mysterious suddenly. So
yes, it seems I come from a Buddhist background, and there's the kind of the same practice which is Vipassana in the Tibetan Mahamudra or Dzogchen practice, and the description is that it's the knowing is co-rising, and each time that it's an object, it can't be the knowing. So is it And there's a kind of unfindability. You can't find it. Is
Yes.
it something like that?
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, so definitely something does co-arise, you might say. But I guess and even within Buddhist traditions, there are differences in the ultimate meanings of these things, or
Mhm.
I should say, philosophical interpretations of these things. Um, hmm, I would say, see, so the hmm, so I do agree there is a kind of co-arising going on, you might say, but the but at the same time, I would suggest that it's not. We don't, and at least in the Ramana Maharshi Advaita Vedanta tradition, and maybe the Vipassana tradition, I'm not familiar enough to say.
It's not Vipassana like in the Theravadan Buddhist, which there's no self, but it's the Vipassana in Tibetan Buddhism, which is really influenced by Kashmir Shivaism. So it's I think it's there's a proximity, maybe.
No, I think 100% there's a proximity. 100%. I mean, I guess all I'm trying to point out, and I'm just hesitant because I don't know that tradition very well. I'm not sure if it's saying this or not, but is that one is nevertheless mm, not stopping with the idea of co-arising, but is hunting regardless what that other piece of information is. So one cannot simply say, oh, it co-arises, the search is stopped.
Mhm.
No, one has to say, um, I'm looking for it. What is it? What is that piece? What is that piece? Because we wouldn't accept basically that it's coming from the object. We would say
Mhm.
that that part of it, I want to see it. 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 Right. And so one is looking for it, and so in the process, of course, like you say, oh, in Vipassana, it's or in Buddhism, or certain versions of Buddhism
Mhm.
anyway, it's viewed as no self, which makes sense actually, even though in Hinduism we call it the self, because the the usual self is, like you say, in a sense, the co-arising self. So it's the self that is the subject that is associated with an object. But the real self, quote unquote, in Hinduism or in Advaita Vedanta, is the self that does not need to have an object, which makes it radically different from the usual self. In fact, it's so radically different that one could call it no self. We don't call it no self because it's a philosophical difference, but
Mhm.
that's just words. The point being, it's not the usual self, but it encompasses the usual self. It's not just the usual self. The usual self is the usual self is the usual waking self. The usual waking self is always the subject in association with the object. When I say subject, I mean that which is the sense of being aware, the sense of being aware, that sense of being alive, the sense of being here. So that sense, when investigated, will show itself to be a reflection of something else that's not just that. That's not just that. The normal, ordinary sense, ordinary waking sense of self is always in association with an object. But the self with a capital S, which is the true self, so to say, does not always require an object. And that makes it so different from the usual self that in some sense we could say it's beyond self. So, it's a matter of words. But
Mhm.
but the point is, one is hunting, one is not hunting directly the true self. One is looking at the usual, ordinary, moment to moment
Mhm.
sense of experience. And within that sense of experience, hunting for the knowledge of the experiencer. Like I feel like I'm the experiencer, that I know that I'm experiencing, and that I'm not the experienced object. That sense, which is a very ordinary, everyday experience, we're trying to turn our mental gaze and hunt that down. And as our gaze turns, we find a series of objects which go from, in the technical terms, grosser, meaning more physical, to subtler, meaning more mental, until some kind of perspective change happens, at which point it will then be shown that this sense of experiencership turns out to be something quite different than what it originally seemed. Okay, basically. So this is the basic progression.
It's really clear, and I can't help to think about the Buddhist curriculum, because it seems like the practice seems so close, and
Yes.
there's the other practice that seems close. It's surrender.
Yes.
It's the do nothing practices that maybe the same thing that we can find in Dzogchen or Mahamudra, and it's just being and just letting the world arise. And
Yes. Yes. Yes.
I have some questions about this practice, because it seems very uh, difficult. And can you explain the
Yes.
basis of this practice, and
Yeah.
how to be trustful in this practice?
So yes, so okay, so let me explain surrender now, since you bring that up. Look, both practices require trust, and in fact, this is the whole game, the whole battle, the whole practice is around this. Because what happens is, when you try to do inquiry or surrender, and by the way, these are really two sides of the same coin, as I'll show you in a little bit. As you try to do them continuously, every waking moment, you will inevitably run into the question of how to maintain them while one is in the world and doing other activities. And the answer is, the answer I always give is, you're never trying to juggle two balls at once. You are always only trying to juggle one ball. That's the practice. Everything else can go away. Now, how do you become trustful? The practice itself is the answer. The practice itself. So just like anything else, you would not expect to master the violin in one day. You will subject the mental phenomena, which are the attachments. You see, why does it bother us to try to do self-inquiry while we are doing an important work assignment or talking to somebody we want to impress? The answer is because we believe we're the person, and the person is concerned about keeping their job, making the right impression on somebody, or whatever, keeping a certain image of themselves or whatever else, right? And they're afraid that if they focus on the practice, those things won't be able to get done. So the philosophical framework, which again, there's so much to say, right? And you can go into detail about these things to some extent, but essentially, right, you're not the person, right? The basic illusion is, I'm the person. In fact, the truth is, in the profound sense, you're not the person. What does that mean? It means that not only are you not subject to the limitations of the person, it also means you are not the doer. You are not the doer. No action that is taken is your responsibility. No thought that is thought comes from you. It's not. None of your thoughts, none of your feelings, none of your actions, none of your decisions, none of them are you. You're actually effectively watching a movie on a screen. You're watching a movie on a screen. You and the audience cannot affect the character on the screen. It doesn't matter. You can scream at them. You can yell at them. You can sleep. It doesn't matter what you do. The character on the screen will execute the script that they are given. So, but it doesn't feel like them. That's the illusion. I know it doesn't feel like that. That's the illusion. The illusion is kept up by the attachments. So how do the attachments manifest? Well, when you're doing the practice, you'll find their manifestation when you are finding the practice difficult to keep up, because you're afraid of not having something fall through because you're not paying attention to it. So there's one side of you which is like, I'm a person. It's important for me to keep my job, and I need to focus on this work. And there's another part, which is a spiritual part, which is saying, yeah, but you say you're the person, but who is speaking exactly? Who is thinking? Who are you in this picture? When you say the word I, this is what inquiry is asking, what exactly are you even talking about?
Mm.
The first thing that inquiry is trying to bring into the picture is you don't actually know who you are. This is not a figurative thing. This is the literal truth. So if you can, through inquiry or surrender, touch that genuine confusion, because it is there, you see, it's hidden, right? You will have done yourself a great service in weakening the attachments. Because the reality is, again, I give this example, sometimes I say, okay, imagine you are in the middle of an important work meeting or something like that, and you go to the bathroom, okay? Now, in the bathroom, you look in the mirror, and in the mirror, you see somebody else's face in the mirror. Okay. Now, you leave the bathroom, okay? Everybody treats you just the same. Like, nobody notices any different. You go back into the bathroom. Again, you look in the mirror. Again, you see somebody else's face. Now, how important at this juncture is the rest of the work meeting? Like, probably not important at all, right? Because suddenly you are freaked out. Am I going insane? What is happening to me? Am I dreaming? Like, am I having a mental illness or breakdown? Like, what is going on, right? This is, in fact, the actual situation. We all are in a situation, actually, where we have this profound mental confusion. But what it is it's too disturbing to look at. So we pretend it out of existence. What inquiry and surrender are trying to do is they're trying to say, look, you literally do not know who you are in this picture. Literally, right? If you can touch that, that's going to suddenly make all the usual commitments of life irrelevant, because you're going to be like, what is going on here? There's something very strange going on. And there is something very strange going on. There is something very strange going on. So the process of the practice will hit these blocks, okay? And what you want to do is, if you're doing inquiry, for example, is, okay, I can't focus on the inquiry right now because I have to pick up my daughter from school. Okay, so this thought goes on in the mind. Then what you want to do in inquiry is say, okay, who's aware of this thought? My daughter from school. This is a thought that flashes in the mind. You identify with that thought. That's why it feels compelling. Like, I'm a person who has a daughter. The daughter goes to school, and it's me, my responsibility to go pick her up. Who's having this thought? Right? I. Who is I? What is that? What is that sensation? How do I know I am? Where is that coming from? Right? This is what inquiry, again, is looking. We say these in question form. It's not really meant to be something to think about. The point is, you can think about it for a while. It's fine. It's not a big deal. But the point is, ultimately, we're turning our gaze towards I. There's some sense of I. What is that sense? Where is it coming from? What exactly is it? So that's how, through this process, what happens is there are weaker attachments and there are stronger attachments. And usually over time, what happens is, as you might guess, the weaker attachments will yield to this process, and the stronger attachments will eventually yield to the process. And what happens is you do the inquiry, maybe on something you don't care about that much. And then what happens is you encounter, for a moment, some sense of peace, because that's where inquiry will eventually lead. It will help you touch peace for a bit. As you touch peace, you're like, oh, this is nice. and you want to repeat the experience, right? So slowly, the candy that's given to you to keep you going on the practice is peace, some bits and drops of peace, okay? And so over time, you want more and more of that peace, because that peace is so much easier than we normally try to get happiness through the external world. When you realize, oh, I can get some happiness through the internal search, it's so much easier. So slowly, the mind starts to slowly go through a process of doing the inquiry or the surrender, which I'll describe, and gaining more and more peace from that, and less dependent on peace from external sources. And through that process, attachments weaken. Through that process, desire for spiritual liberation occurs. Because why? Because as you get that peace, you're like, it becomes increasingly annoying when you fall out of that peace. So you're like, I want a final exit. I don't want to keep being on this treadmill. Okay. So you want, like, I want out of the illusion, right? So once that desire builds up stronger and stronger, as the desire builds up stronger and stronger, more concentration, attachments weaken further. But why? Because you start to realize, what are the barriers to my seeing through the illusion? The barriers are these attachments. I care about these things. Why do I care about these things? Because I think I'm this person. But who thinks I'm this person, right? So it all gets fed into the machine. And as you do it again and again and again, more peace, weaker attachments, more desire for spiritual liberation, and again, it grinds through them. That's what happens. And then trust increases, right? When there is perfect trust, the journey is basically finished, okay? So you start from a position of very low trust, and you just do a little bit, whatever you can. It's like water eroding a cliff, It may take 1,000 years or 100,000 years, but eventually the cliff is eroded. Similarly, you do a little bit of the practice at first, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more, and on it goes, and it builds like that. So that's the answer, basically. And so now let me get to surrender, okay? So surrender, the same set of issues apply, okay? So I'll say, by the way, so again, surrender, inquiry, sides of a coin. I'll show you why in a second. Again, surrender is supposed to be an all-the-time practice. And I'll also say that surrender and inquiry are each a complete path, but they can also be mixed and matched. People can do both. You can do one, you can do the other. Some people by temperament, most people by temperament will favor one or the other. More curious, problem-solving people may like the riddle of self-inquiry. People who are more motivated by, I just want peace now, would maybe more motivated by surrender. Okay, so the analogy I always give with surrender is, maybe you should think of a different analogy, but anyway, I stick with this one, is imagine there's a TV in the corner, okay? There's a TV in the corner, and something is playing on it. So your job in surrender is ignore the TV. Okay, you do not have to turn the TV off. You do not have to change the channel on the TV. You do not have to accept the TV as good. You don't have to say love anything in the TV. You don't have to think anything good or bad about the TV type things. You simply have to, sorry, 1 second here. You simply have to ignore it as best you can. Okay. So in the same way, the first part of the surrender instruction is ignore everything. Okay. As best you can, ignore. What does that mean? It means, again, in particular, basically, whatever is going on in the physical or mental world, do not let your attention get completely sucked into it. That is to say, keep recognizing that whatever is going on is just a phenomenon. Do not take it to be real. Do not allow your mind to become, to view it as everything. Keep recognizing that it has a border around it. This is just a picture, right? To keep recognizing that again and again and again and again and again and again and again, right? Continuously recognizing that. That's what it means to ignore it. So that means I'm never allowing myself to fall into any particular thought, okay? And the second instruction, which is really, really connected to the first one, is the truth, is do not use your willpower on anything except the practice. Except the practice. So what do I mean by willpower? What I mean by willpower is that sense of like effortful, burdensome, deliberate action. Like it feels like I have to like focus and do this thing. So that only happens really, for seekers anyway, when when there's a belief in the reality of something, right? Because why would you put effort in something that was unreal, right? So you're in a desert, you see some water, you run towards it deliberately because you believe it's real. If you know it's a mirage, then you wouldn't use your willpower to run towards it. So, there are many things that are not governed by this kind of willpower, do not seem to be governed by it, right? You don't have to use your willpower to breathe, for example. You don't have to use your willpower to make your heart beat. And there are many unconscious actions that we do that are not willpower governed. But the point is, to keep your willpower in abeyance, relaxed, right? Except for the practice, because the practice is a practice of, though it's called surrender, it is a practice of vigilance. Because the idea is that what we're trying to do is, like, the mind is like a fortress, and there are continuous thoughts coming like arrows or invaders that are trying to get you to believe in them. And your task is to defend your relaxation. So it's a kind of an irony, right? Because this defensive relaxation requires hyper attention. So you need this extreme attention, because the moment you notice a thought, you want to recognize it as a thought. Now, again, to be clear, we're not trying to repress any thought or feeling. We're not trying to say you shouldn't be here. We're not trying to shove it out of awareness. We're not trying to squelch it or crush it. We are merely trying to recognize this is just a thought. This is not reality. And I don't have to take you seriously. That's the point, right? We have to recognize whatever phenomena occur, it's totally okay. You can feel whatever you want. You can feel anger. You can feel hatred. You can feel unhappiness. These are not problems. Issue is only whether you take them to be real or not. So our task in surrender is, do not take anything that's going on to be real. Do not put effort into anything at all, except the practice of not taking anything to be real and not putting effort into anything at all. This continuous practice, okay? So,
but there's one kind of thought when you practice that, which is, okay, so there's 3 weeks, a perfect surrender. Then there's the doubt, which creeps in, and but what should I do? Because or how to be sure that what's next will be good or moral or effective, or and it seems that there's some kind of thoughts that have more attracting power.
Yeah, sure, of course, absolutely. So, I mean, so you mentioned two different things, it sounds like. One is, how can you make sure that the actions that the person will take will be good or effective? Okay, well, the answer again goes back to what I said earlier, which is, you know, and again, this is why it can be useful to have an intellectual framework, okay? You know, because this gives you some answers, not perfect answers to these questions, but essentially, right, again, you're not the doer. So the truth is, even now, when you think you are putting forth your so-called willpower, the reality is you are not affecting what the character is doing. So what the character does, whether it's good or whether it's bad, whether it's effective or whether it's not effective, these are not in your control, even now. So we can dismiss that. I'll come back to it in a second, actually. And the other question is, yeah, certain thoughts have more attracting power. Well, that's certainly true, because those thoughts are connected to deeper and more core attachments. So the basic idea, again, you know, when we talk about these things is, I mean, I can give several responses to how to deal with these, right? So one immediate response I can say as well, you know, this is one of the advantages of self-inquiry sometimes, that when we deal with a sticky attachment, self-inquiry is it's more directly pointing out to you who is concerned about a good outcome in the situation. Like, you're concerned about the situation, but why are you concerned? Oh, because, you know, I care about my health. Okay, who are you, though? Who are you, right? Self-inquiry is trying to point out, who are you? Literally, show me where you are. Who are you? Your health? Who are you? Who's speaking? Who has this thought about your health, right? So in that way, it shows you that you're confused about who you are. And I mean, and again, we can't stop with the confusion. We have to hunt down the truth. But the point is, even the confusion has great power in weakening an attachment, because it throws you into doubt. Yeah, who am I talking about? I don't even know who I am. So that's one response. Okay, another response I can give is, sometimes, and this connects to both the goodness and morality, and also the, you know, some thoughts are more attractive than others. In some cases, if a thought or feeling is extremely sticky, extremely resistant, then it might be the case that, for example, there is some emotional baggage that is there that you have to go into therapy or some other route to deal with it, right? So sometimes that's the case, that there's an obstacle that has to be dealt with in some other means. You have to step away from the spiritual and move to other context, possibly. So those are two ways of dealing with it, right? And then of course there's the actual surrender itself is an answer, right? So when the doubt comes up, ignore it, right? This doubt is another thought, ignore it. Another doubt comes up, ignore that, right? That's itself, because what happens is it's like bubbles coming up from water, right? You just keep ignoring it if you can. Now, if you cannot, you resort to these other measures, right? And you step down to whatever you can do in that process. So it does require some discernment, right? Like, and each person's path is different, right? So you have to kind of figure out, well, maybe I'm being told this now. I have to go here now. I have to go that way. I have to go this way. But yeah, that's basically what I would say. One thing I want to note before I move on as well is to say I was talking about how surrender and self-inquiry are sides of a coin. Now, why is that? Because in self-inquiry, one is hunting for the sense of I. As one looks for it, one is going through a series of objects, right? You're hunting the subject, which is the experiencer. As one hunts the subject, one goes through a series of objects. Why? Because they are the objects that have purported to be the subject, right? So, you look through them and then to the next one, to the next one, to the next one, right? Each time you're saying, well, who's aware of this? Who's aware of this? Who's aware of this? And so what happens is that you are hunting the subject, and in the process, what are you doing with the objects? Well, you're ignoring them. Well, isn't that the surrender instruction? Ignore objects, right? Similarly, in surrender, you are told, ignore all the objects, all the physical objects, all the mental objects, ignore them all. Well, when you ignore those objects and you continuously regard them as reflections and do not permit your attention to remain stranded in any of them, okay, you are essentially pulling your attention away from the objects. Well, when you pull your attention away from the objects, towards what must it go? Towards the subject. There's no other place to go. So when the surrender practice is happening, one moves the attention away from the objects, walking backwards into I, because you move away from not I. You walk backwards into I. So in that sense, you see, surrender and inquiry are really the same direction, only the surrender is ignore the objects. That's the main instruction. And in self-inquiry, it's hunt the subject. That's the main instruction, so you're going forward into the subject, Anyway, so they're basically ultimately the same process. And they both will invoke your issues of trust, and they both will deal with resistances that come from your attachments. And they both are concentration practices, and they both are discernment practices. Because unlike, there's a difference between normal concentration practices, which are static, like, okay, focus on this thing or focus on this field, okay? But in surrender and inquiry, there's a big difference, which is that the object of concentration is not fixed. It's moving, You're always moving your attention, right? In surrender, you're moving your attention away from the object. The objects are changing. The objects will change from grosser to subtler, again, from physical to the mental. And so, as one moves away from the objects, the field of objects changes and the attention becomes subtler and subtler and subtler. And in that process, one sees more and more subtle objects, right? Until finally, the illusion itself, which is the ego, right? The ego object. Ego. What is the ego object? Not an object at all. The object, ego is the nexus of the illusion, which is that, again, the sense of I really is what it is. Well, what is that? Well, it's magic is what it is. So, as you move towards that magical object, you see subtler and subtler and subtler. So it's not just focusing on one thing. This is the advantage of these practices is they're not just concentration. Concentration is very important. Concentration gives peace. But in addition to concentration, you need discernment, which is seeing more clearly. So both inquiry and surrender are methods of looking at your experience and seeing what is unappreciated within those experiences, something which is right there, but which we don't normally observe, which is hidden in plain sight because we aren't looking clearly. We don't look clearly because we don't want to look clearly. Because if we looked clearly, it would threaten who we think we are. So this whole process is looking clearly and confronting over time that threat to our identity and becoming more and more comfortable with that with the possibility that we may not be who we think we are.
How does one know when it's finished?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say in a nutshell, the answer is yes. So it's a tricky question to answer because again, this is ultimately this is a game we're playing, right? Spiritual research is ultimately a game. Okay, it's ultimately a game, and it's within in that sense in the field of illusion, because only within illusion does there seem to be a problem, and only within illusion does there seem to be an answer, right? So only within illusion do we seek, and only within illusion do we find. And yet there's a profound irony because the finding is that the finder and the seeker were not at all what they seemed to be. And in fact, in some sense, didn't exist. So the seeker, the finder, and the problem and the solution, all of them were fictional. So, it's a kind of paradox for the mind. That said, because this makes it a little problematic to say something like, I have finished, or I have found the truth, because the truth is that the I that can say that it is found is precisely the I that is found not to exist. So how can it be that I have found? Because who is the finder? Who's the finder? Who found? A big problem. I mean, the answer is you really can't, in some sense, the mind simply cannot overcome this paradox. The truth cannot be put in words. But that said, within our little game notion here, there is a finding. There is a finding, and that finding is self-validating, because it will become apparent upon the finding why it is the case that there could be no doubt about it. Because the mind is the instrument of doubt. The mind is the instrument of doubt. The finding is there is something that is not the mind. So that can't be doubted in the same way because it's beyond the field of doubt. So, yeah, in a nutshell, the answer is yes. Okay, let's just put it that way. There is something which is a self-validating finding which is beyond doubt. It will be known. It will be known. Even if I want to say that there's an asterisk, okay, I'm going to add an asterisk, but that asterisk, when the seeker goes to that point, then they can discover that asterisk for themselves.
That's clear. And for my last question, can we go alone on the path, or is it important to have a teacher to benefit from these teachings?
I mean, it would be wise to seek a teacher for sure. Although I will say that the most important teacher for sure is clearly the inner teacher. There is an inner teacher. There has to be an inner teacher for every seeker. In fact, the very desire to become a seeker is already prompted by the inner teacher. And it is the inner teacher that will guide the seeker all the way to the end in some sense. That said, the inner teacher will usually prompt the seeker to find a teacher or multiple teachers, depending on their path, because it is highly facilitative. The teacher provides many things depending on the student, everything from intellectual framework, a certain degree of encouragement, and most of all, probably, of course, their ability to answer questions, but most of all, their way of being, something about their way of being is arguably transmitted. So I would say, yes, for the vast majority of people, a teacher would be wise. Now, some people, they don't need it. Like Ramana Maharshi did not need an explicit teacher. That said, he himself would say, I did all that learning in my previous lives. That's why it seemed like I did it so quickly and easily. He became realized, quote unquote, at 17 without a teacher, without anybody, but he would say, I did all that in the previous life. That's why I came so easily this time. So, that's that's another way of explaining things. Previous lives has its own set of issues, many philosophical discussions about that we could have, but basically, yes, I think a teacher for most people would be wise. Now which teacher, what kind of teacher is his own set of problems. But again, Maharishi gave at least one pointer on this. He said, try to look for a teacher in whose presence you feel some sense of peace.
Okay, that's a good advice.
Yeah.
As we come to the end of this interview, I sincerely thank you, Akilesh, for this fascinating conversation. I will include the links for your books and your website, which are very complete, and you have a YouTube channel also with the teachings and the satsangs. So I will put all the links, and I will upload the video in 3 or 4 weeks because I have to do the translation and the subtitles. So I'm a slow worker. But
Not at all.
Thank you again.
All right. Thank you so much for having me on. Okay.
And have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.